Three elders of the Kang family stepped into the aisle before the doors had even fully closed behind the wedding party, blocking the path to the altar. "Please,"
Please,
the oldest of them said, voice shaking.
don't marry
"Don't
her."
marry her." The orchestra stopped mid-note. Kang Min-jae's jaw tightened. His eyes stayed on the woman beside him. Pearl Okoye did not look afraid. Slowly, she slid the engagement ring off her finger. "If walking away saves your future," she whispered, "I'll do it." Min-jae closed his hand around hers, folding her fingers back over the ring. "Min-jae," his grandmother said, voice trembling, "you don't understand what you're throwing away." "I've understood it since the day I proposed," he said, not turning to look at her. He turned to the pastor. "Continue." The pastor
Dearly
hesitated
beloved,
only a second before nodding and lifting the book again.
we are gathered here today.
The wedding began. If you have ever wondered what it costs a man to choose love over power, stay with this one until the end. Because what happens next will surprise you. And don't forget to like this video if a story like this deserves to be told properly. The vows were short. Pearl's hands trembled slightly as she repeated them, not from fear, but from the weight of everyone in that hall watching a man throw away his birthright in real time. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, there was no applause, only silence, and the quiet, furious retreat of three old men who had failed to stop what they came to prevent, their footsteps echoing against marble long after the doors closed behind them. Min-jae knew the price before the applause could even start. He had known it the moment he proposed, kneeling in front of Pearl in a quiet garden months earlier, fully aware of what his family would say if they ever found out. But knowing a price and paying it are two very different things, and the bill arrived before he had even removed his tuxedo jacket. His phone would not stop buzzing, messages, calls, then silence. The kind of silence that meant something had already been decided without him. By the time he and Pearl reached the hotel that evening, still dressed for a celebration that would never happen, his grandfather's assistant was waiting outside their door with a single envelope in gloved hands. Inside was one sentence: effective immediately, Kang Min-jae was no longer heir to the Kang family enterprise. The consequences did not trickle in. They arrived all at once. His accounts were frozen by morning. Every card in his wallet declined at a breakfast counter while Pearl watched in silence. His executive access was revoked before lunch. Security badges deactivated. His name erased from building directories, as if he had never worked there at all. The security detail that had shadowed him since childhood was reassigned within hours. Men who once called him young master now refused to meet his eyes. By evening, hotel management informed them, with visible discomfort, that the penthouse suite had been unbooked by a call from the family office. Min-jae packed one suitcase. He did not argue with the staff. He did not call his grandfather to plead his case. He simply zipped the suitcase closed, picked it up, and walked toward the elevator, still in his wedding shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow. Pearl walked beside him, still in her wedding dress, heels in her hand, saying nothing because there was nothing that needed to be said. The doorman at the hotel entrance would not look at either of them. "I knew the price before I said yes," Min-jae told her quietly as the elevator doors closed, his voice steady despite everything collapsing around him. "Then let me help you carry it," Pearl answered, and for the first time all day, something in his shoulders loosened. Neither of them noticed the man in the lobby lowering a camera as they passed, or the way he immediately typed a message into his phone the second the elevator doors shut. Someone, somewhere, wanted to know exactly what Kang Min-jae did next, and exactly how fast he would fall. They ended up at the door of a small, cramped apartment on the edge of the city, home to Mr. Choi, a retired bodyguard who had once guarded Min-jae's father and had never quite been able to walk away from the family, even after the family walked away from itself. He opened the door before they could knock, as if he had been expecting them for hours. a pot of rice already cooking behind him. "I don't have much," the old man said, waving them inside without ceremony, taking Pearl's suitcase from her hands before she could protest. "But I have enough for 2 more. Sit. Eat first. Talk later." That night, lying on a mattress on the floor of a one-room apartment that smelled of instant noodles and old newspaper, Min-jae finally allowed himself to say what had been sitting in his chest since the wedding hall. "I'm sorry," he said, staring at the ceiling. "You lost your future the moment you married me. Your name is going to be tied to mine now, and mine isn't worth anything anymore." Pearl turned to face him in the dark. There was no self-pity in her voice, only a kind of steady conviction that made him believe, for the first time that day, that they might actually survive this. "I married you," she said. "Not your address, not your accounts, not your title. If you think I didn't already imagine a life without any of that, you weren't listening when I said yes." He reached for her hand in the dark, and neither of them said anything else for a long while, because nothing else needed saying. The next morning, Pearl put on one of her 2 remaining work outfits and walked into her office as if nothing had changed, because she refused to let anything change the one thing she had built entirely on her own. The restoration of a historic district in the heart of Seoul, a project that had taken her 3 years to win and design, block by block, building by building. But something had changed. Her clients could feel it before she even sat down at her desk. Wealthy families who had once fought for her attention now scheduled meetings only to cancel them by lunchtime, citing vague scheduling conflicts that fooled no one. Emails stopped being answered. A senior partner at the firm found reasons to avoid eye contact in the hallway, suddenly very interested in his phone whenever she walked past. By the end of the week, one of her oldest clients called to cancel an entire wing of the restoration contract, offering no real explanation beyond a stiff apology and a promise to revisit things later. She said nothing about it to Min-jae that evening. She did not need to. He could see it in the careful, practiced calm on her face, the same calm he now recognized as the mask she wore whenever something hurt more than she wanted to admit. "They're pulling away from the project," he said quietly, not as a question. "Some of them," she admitted. "Not all of them. I'll rebuild what I need to rebuild." Neither of them noticed the photographer who had followed Pearl from the office to the subway station, snapping frame after frame of a woman who used to have everything, and now, by every visible measure, had almost nothing. The photos would end up in a folder on someone's desk by midnight, alongside dozens of others taken over the following weeks. Someone wanted proof of exactly how far the Kang heir had fallen. The question was who, and why they cared so much. Mr. Choi noticed something else, something he mentioned only once, quietly, while pouring tea for the 2 of them one evening after Pearl had already gone to bed. "In 30 years of this work," he said, "I learned that people don't watch someone that closely unless they're planning something. Watching costs money. Nobody spends money on someone they've already forgotten." Min-jae turned that thought over for days, without saying it out loud to Pearl, not wanting to add fear to a life that already carried enough of it. But he started sleeping lighter, listening for footsteps on the stairwell outside, memorizing the faces of strangers who lingered too long near the building. He also began, quietly and without telling anyone, taking small jobs he never would have considered a year earlier, repairing motorbikes for a shop 2 streets over, hauling deliveries for a market that paid in cash at the end of each shift. The work was beneath anything he had ever been trained for, and he did it anyway, coming home with grease under his fingernails and a strange, unfamiliar satisfaction in earning something with his own hands, rather than inheriting it. "You don't have to do that," Pearl told him one night, noticing the calluses forming on her husband's palms. "I want to," he said. "For the first time in my life, I want to earn something instead of being handed it." Weeks passed in that small apartment, and something unexpected happened. They got stronger. Pearl kept working, quietly rebuilding client trust one honest conversation at a time, taking smaller commissions she once would have turned down, staying late to prove her restoration methods still worked even without a famous name attached to the paperwork. Min-jae, stripped of every title he had once held, began quietly searching for honest work outside the family's reach, refusing every backdoor offer that came from men still loyal to him in secret, men who whispered that they could smuggle him funds, favors, protection. If only he asked. He never asked. They hid nothing from each other, not the fear, not the exhaustion, not the moments when either of them wanted to give up. Some nights, Pearl came home too tired to speak and simply sat on the floor next to him, saying nothing, and he understood that silence was its own kind of honesty. Struggle, it turned out, was a better architect of intimacy than luxury had ever been. Then the letters started. The first one arrived taped to the door of Pearl's office. No return address, no signature. Just a single typed sentence. Leave Korea before your husband pays the price. Pearl read it twice, folded it neatly, and slid it into her bag without telling a single co-worker, keeping her expression perfectly composed for the rest of the day. That evening, she handed it directly to Min-jae the moment he walked through the door. "I don't keep secrets from my husband," she said, watching his face carefully as he read it, his hands going very still. Min-jae's jaw tightened, but he did not forbid her from working, did not insist she hide, did not try to control the situation the way the old version of himself, the version raised inside an organization built on control, might have. Instead, he quietly increased security around her project sites without interfering with a single decision she made, hiring 2 of Mr. Choi's old contacts to watch the perimeter without ever stepping onto the site itself. "We face this together," he said. "Both of it. Every letter, every threat, all of it goes through both of us." More letters followed, each one sharper than the last. Then anonymous legal complaints hit Pearl's restoration project, filed by shell companies no one could trace, tying her permits up in review after review. Then something worse. Min-jae discovered his own cousin, recently installed as the new heir, was making reckless, erratic calls that were quietly wrecking decades of discipline inside the organization. Violence, once rare and controlled under Min-jae's steady hand, began creeping back into streets he had spent years keeping calm. Someone was using Pearl to reach him. But why did her 3-year-old restoration project suddenly matter enough to attack? Min-jae spent 3 sleepless nights combing through old files Mr. Choi still had access to, land registries and permit records that painted an odd picture. The block Pearl was restoring sat directly above a corridor of old underground infrastructure that connected to properties owned, several shell companies removed, by developers who had spent a decade trying and failing to demolish that same district for a much larger, much more profitable project. Pearl's restoration hadn't just preserved history. It had permanently blocked their plans. "They've wanted this land for 10 years, Min-jae told Pearl, spreading the documents across Mr. Choi's kitchen table. "You didn't just save some old buildings. You cost them a fortune, and you did it before either of us ever knew the other existed." Pearl stared at the papers for a long time, pieces of her own past clicking into place in ways she never expected. "I thought I was fighting for families who didn't have anywhere else to go," she said quietly. "I didn't know I was standing in the way of something this big." "You were," Min-jae said. "And it turns out I'd been circling the same enemy for years without realizing our paths had already crossed." The answer came from an unexpected visitor, a retired priest, elderly and soft-spoken, who arrived at Mr. Choi's apartment one evening asking specifically for Pearl, refusing tea, refusing to sit, as if the weight of what he carried wouldn't allow him to get comfortable. He told them a story neither of them had heard before, not even from each other. 2 years before she ever met Min-jae, Pearl had defended a group of migrant families whose homes were scheduled for illegal demolition by a group of corrupt developers hiding behind a maze of paperwork. She had refused bribes large enough to buy a house of her own. She had refused threats meant to frighten her into silence, threats that had once left her too afraid to walk home alone for a month. She had won the case in court against every expectation and quietly walked away without ever telling anyone what it cost her to do it. Min-jae sat in stunned silence as the priest spoke, because he had not learned this story from Pearl. He had learned it 2 years earlier, while secretly investigating those same corrupt developers for his family's own reasons, following a paper trail that had led him, without his knowledge at the time, straight to a young architect who refused to back down. "That was the day I first respected you," he finally admitted, looking at her the way a man looks at someone he has quietly admired for far longer than he ever confessed. "I watched you walk out of that courthouse and I told my men to find out everything about you. I never pursued you back then. I told myself duty came before love. I told myself a lot of things back then." Pearl sat with that truth for a long moment, and something in her chest loosened. He had not married her out of impulse or rebellion or some reckless whim against his family. He had chosen her because of exactly who she was, long before an aisle, long before elders tried to block it. "You watched me for 2 years and never said a word?" she asked, half disbelieving, half moved beyond words. "I told myself I was being patient," he said. "I was being a coward. There's a difference. And I only understood that the day I finally spoke to you. But if those same corrupt developers were still active, were they connected to the letters, the sabotage, the sudden legal attacks on her project?" The priest's visit had answered one question and opened 3 more. The answer arrived violently. Pearl's restoration site was sabotaged overnight. Scaffolding deliberately weakened, equipment destroyed, months of survey work scattered across the mud. Days later, her chief engineer was taken from the site in broad daylight, dragged into an unmarked van in front of 2 horrified workers. It was a trap, built to lure Min-jae straight into it. Min-jae immediately began organizing a rescue with the handful of men still loyal to him, men who had followed him not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect. Pearl refused police involvement, refused to sit safely in the apartment while someone else risked everything for a crisis born from her own project. "I know that district better than anyone alive," she told him, already pulling out her survey maps, spreading them across Mr. Choi's small kitchen table. "There are tunnels under those buildings that haven't been mapped since the occupation era. I found them during restoration surveys. Nobody logged them officially because they weren't part of the historical registry. I know exactly where they lead." Min-jae wanted to refuse her. Every instinct trained into him screamed to keep her far from danger, to lock the door and tell her to wait, the way his family had trained him to protect what mattered most, by controlling it completely. But he had learned something in that small apartment that no mafia upbringing had ever taught him. "Lead the way," he said instead. Pearl guided his men through forgotten underground maintenance tunnels beneath the historic district, using nothing but memory, instinct, and the confidence of someone who had spent 3 years learning every hidden vein of that neighborhood. The tunnels were narrow, damp, lit only by phone flashlights, but she moved through them without hesitation, calling out turns before anyone else could even see them coming. At one fork, 2 of Min-jae's men wanted to go right, certain it led toward the warehouse faster. Pearl stopped them cold. "Right floods during high tide," she said. "It's been flooding for 60 years. Left is longer, but it's the only dry route this time of night." Nobody argued with her again after that. They reached the engineer before the ambush above ground could close its trap, bound and gagged, exactly where the tunnel map said he'd be. They freed him and slipped out through a route the enemy never anticipated, because they had never anticipated Pearl herself. Above them, through a grate, they could hear the men still waiting to spring a trap on a rescue party that had already come and gone. Standing in the tunnel afterward, breathless and covered in dust, she looked at Min-jae with a fire he had never seen in her before. "You don't protect me by hiding me," she said. "You protect me by trusting me." From that night forward, Min-jae stopped treating her as someone to shield and started treating her as someone to stand beside. An equal partner in every decision that followed, consulted before plans were made rather than informed after they were finished. If a woman like Pearl deserves that kind of respect, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because stories like this deserve to be seen by people who understand what real loyalty looks like. But the ambush raised a darker question neither of them wanted to face. Someone inside Min-jae's own circle had leaked their rescue route down to the exact minute. Someone close enough to know their plans before they were even finalized. Someone who had sat across from Min-jae at dinner tables for years. The truth cut deeper than either of them expected. The leak traced back to Min-jae's longtime mentor, the man who had trained him since childhood, who had taught him patience, discipline, restraint. Every principle Min-jae had built his identity on. The mentor had betrayed him out of a twisted belief that the reckless new successor, Min-jae's cousin, would restore the old family's brutal power in ways a marriage to an outsider never could. "You chose a stranger over 30 years of loyalty," the mentor said when Min-jae finally confronted him. No attempt at denial in his voice, only a kind of tired conviction. "I did what I thought would save this family." "You nearly got a man killed to prove a point," Min-jae answered, his voice low and controlled in a way that unsettled the room far more than shouting would have. "I trained under you for 20 years. You taught me that loyalty without honesty isn't loyalty at all. It's just fear wearing a nicer name." "Your cousin will rebuild what your father let slip," the mentor said. "He understands strength. You understand mercy. Mercy doesn't hold an empire together." "Maybe not," Min-jae said, "but it holds a marriage together. It holds a man together. I'd rather have that than an empire built on men like you." The confrontation was quiet, almost unbearably so. Two men who had known each other for 20 years, facing the wreckage of it in a dimly lit warehouse. The rest of the room held its breath. Min-jae defeated him without hesitation. His men expected an execution, the traditional response to betrayal at this level. Min-jae did something none of them anticipated. He turned his mentor over to prosecutors instead, using property records and evidence that Pearl herself had uncovered while investigating the corrupt developers tied to her restoration project. Mercy, delivered with full knowledge of what mercy would cost him politically, proved far stronger than another act of violence ever could have. "You're going to let the courts decide?" his mentor said, almost disbelieving. "I'm done deciding who lives and who doesn't," Min-jae said. "That was never the kind of man I wanted to be. You just made it easier to prove it." But mercy came with consequences of its own. The betrayal, once exposed publicly, revealed corruption running far deeper inside the Kang family empire than anyone outside it had ever suspected. Investigations began. Business partners grew nervous, pulling contracts one by one. The empire that had once seemed untouchable started showing cracks nobody could hide any longer. Can an organization survive when the very people meant to protect it were the ones selling it out? The answer arrived within weeks, worse than anyone predicted. Without Min-jae's steady leadership, the businesses his family had protected for decades began collapsing one by one. Discipline broke down under his cousin's erratic control. Decisions made out of panic, not strategy. Violence spread through neighborhoods that had been peaceful for years, small disputes escalating into something uglier with no one left to contain them. Foreign investors, once eager to work with the Kang name, quietly pulled out and took their money elsewhere. The same elders who had blocked the aisle at his wedding now stood outside Mr. Choi's tiny apartment asking, almost begging, for Min-jae to return, their expensive coats looking strangely out of place against the building's cracked concrete steps. He looked at each of their faces, men he had once respected without question, and felt none of the satisfaction he might have expected. "The company needs you," the oldest elder said, the same man who had once stood in the aisle. "None of this works without you." "I won't return to any family that rejected my wife," he said simply, and closed the door. Pearl said nothing throughout the entire exchange. She did not gloat. She did not demand an apology on her own behalf. Respect, she had always believed, could never be demanded into existence. It had to be earned, slowly, honestly, or not at all. "You didn't have to say that on my behalf," she told him quietly once the door was closed. "I didn't say it for your behalf," he answered. "I said it because it's true." Will the family that once tried to destroy their marriage finally learn to value character over bloodline? Or will pride cost them everything they have left? The answer came on a gray afternoon 3 weeks later, when the entire Kang family gathered in the same hall where the wedding had nearly been stopped. This time, there were no elders blocking the aisle. Instead, Min-jae's grandfather stood alone at the front of the room, visibly smaller than the man who had once stripped his grandson of everything in a single sentence, his hands folded in front of him like a man preparing for something he had never done before. He did not summon Pearl privately, where an apology could be quietly forgotten. He asked her to stand in front of the entire gathered family, every relative, every executive, every person who had once turned their back on her, and he spoke the words publicly, without flinching. "I judged you," he said, looking directly at Pearl, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent hall. "Because of your race, because you weren't born into this family, because of prejudice I told myself was tradition. I was wrong. Every insult this family has thrown at you, I acknowledge it here, in front of everyone who witnessed it." The room was utterly silent. No one moved. No one dared soften the moment with polite applause. A few relatives who had once whispered behind Pearl's back now stared at the floor, unable to meet her eyes. Then the grandfather turned to Min-jae and formally offered him back everything that had been taken: the succession, the title, the empire built over 3 generations, the accounts, the authority. All of it laid out in front of the entire family as though it had never been withdrawn. Min-jae looked at his grandfather for a long moment, then at Pearl, whose face gave nothing away, offering him no pressure in either direction. The decision, entirely his own, would say everything about who he had truly become. "I don't need the family empire to matter," he finally said, his voice steady enough to carry across the whole hall. "I'm building something new instead. An independent organization dedicated to protecting legitimate businesses from exactly the kind of corruption that almost destroyed us. I don't need this family's name to do that. I proved that these past months, whether anyone here noticed or not." A murmur moved through the crowd, somewhere between shock and something close to admiration. Pearl felt something settle inside her chest as she listened, a quiet certainty that he had never needed an empire to prove who he was. He had proven it the moment he told a pastor to continue a wedding that everyone else in that hall had tried to stop. Later that evening, as they stood together outside the hall where it had all begun, someone from the crowd, one of the very relatives who had once refused to look Pearl in the eye, approached quietly and asked the question that had followed her for months. Was he worth losing an empire? Pearl smiled, the same calm, unshaken smile she had worn since the very first moment 3 elders tried to block an aisle. "I never asked him to lose it," she said. Min-jae reached over and gently took her hand, the same hand he had once closed around a ring she'd tried to give back on the worst and best day of both their lives. "And I'd choose you again," he said, "every single time, no matter what it costs." They walked out of that hall together, no suitcase this time, no elders blocking the way, just two people who had built something worth more than anything either family could have handed them. If this story moved you even a little, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and let us know in the comments which moment hit you the hardest, because stories about real loyalty, earned respect, and love that cost something are exactly the ones worth telling.